The night Gilbert Maddox walked into the Dusty Lantern Saloon in Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1878, he had no intention of doing anything more than drinking one glass of rye whiskey, keeping his back to the wall, and riding out before the fiddle player got too loud. And then Elsie Kendrick crossed the room toward him like a woman who had already made up her mind about something the rest of the world hadn't caught up to yet. Caldwell sat right on the edge of the Chisholm Trail, a town that smelled of cattle and ambition and fresh-cut lumber, the kind of place where men arrived with nothing and either built something or disappeared into the prairie without ceremony. It was a cattle town, in every sense of the word, drovers and trail bosses and gamblers and merchants all crammed together on a main street that turned to mud every time it rained and cracked into pale white dust every time it didn't. The Dusty Lantern was the largest establishment on that street, 2 stories tall with a balcony that overlooked the saloon floor, lanterns strung between the rafters that cast everything in shades of amber and gold, and a fiddle player named Old Clement who had been sawing away at that instrument since before most of the current patrons were born. Gilbert had ridden into Caldwell that afternoon on his big roan horse, Copper, with nothing particular drawing him there, except that the trail he'd been following north had pointed him in that direction, and he hadn't had a reason to turn away. He was 31 years old, lean and weathered in the way that men who live outside tend to become, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples where it had grown too long, and a jaw that seemed to have been carved from the same red sandstone as the bluffs he'd ridden through in the Indian Territory 3 weeks earlier. He wore a brown canvas duster that had seen better years and boots that had walked more miles than most men ride in a lifetime. He was not a man who caused trouble. He was also not a man who smiled easily or spoke more than was necessary, and he had learned long ago that the most efficient way to move through a crowded room was to find a corner of it and stay there. He'd been a cattle drover for 8 years, and before that he'd worked a small ranch in central Texas that had belonged to his father and his father's father before him, until a drought and a series of debts had taken it and left him with nothing but the horse, the duster, and a particular set of skills that the open trail had use for. He had never asked a woman to dance in his 31 years of living. This was not for lack of opportunity. In every cattle town along every trail he'd ever ridden, there had been dances and socials and saloon evenings where the fiddler played and people turned in circles on plank floors. He had watched all of it from whatever corner was available to him. He had watched other men stride forward with their hats in their hands and their faces full of hopeful stupidity, and he had felt something in his chest that he could not quite name, not envy exactly, but something neighboring it. And then he had looked back at his whiskey and decided that whatever that feeling was, it was easier to leave it alone. He told himself it was because he was never in one place long enough. He told himself it was because the trail was his home, and you couldn't very well ask a woman to share a bedroll under a Kansas sky. He told himself a lot of things over the years, and they all had enough truth in them to be convincing, and he kept moving. The Dusty Lantern on that particular Friday evening was fuller than usual, because a cattle drive had just come up the trail, and the drovers had been paid, and were spending it in the enthusiastic and somewhat reckless manner of men who had been eating beans and sleeping on hard ground for 3 months. Old Clement was already playing, something lively and slightly out of tune, and there were 6 or 7 couples turning on the open floor space between the tables. The bar was 3 deep with men waiting for drinks. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of sawdust and spilled beer, and the noise was considerable. Gilbert found his corner. It was near the back wall beside a support post, with a clear view of the door and both staircases. He settled into the chair with the particular stillness of a man who has spent years being invisible in loud places, got his rye whiskey from a passing boy who worked the tables, and began the quiet process of existing at the edges of something he was not part of. He watched the dancers. He could not quite stop himself from doing that. There was a couple near the center of the floor who were clearly very new at this and were laughing at their own mistakes, and something about that loosened a knot he hadn't known was in his chest. He watched an old trail boss attempt a reel with a woman twice his age, who was clearly the superior dancer, and was steering him firmly in the right direction with her hand at his back, and he felt the corner of his mouth try to do something that would have been a smile if he'd let it. And then the crowd shifted in the way that crowds sometimes do, some invisible tide of movement that rearranges itself without apparent cause, and he saw Elsie Kendrick for the first time. She was standing near the bar with a woman he would later learn was her friend and business partner, Clara Whitmore, and she was wearing a dress the color of pine needles, dark green with a cream collar, and her dark auburn hair was pinned up at the back of her head in a way that seemed to be losing the battle with several escaped pieces. She was laughing at something Clara had said, a real laugh, the kind that involved her whole face and made the people nearest to her instinctively look over to see what was funny. She was 26 years old, though Gilbert did not know that yet. She was 5'4" and had the kind of practical bearing that came from a woman who had worked for every single thing she owned and was not ashamed of it. She had been in Caldwell for 2 years. She and Clara ran a small dry goods store on the main street called Kendrick and Whitmore's, which sold fabric and flour and nails and leather goods, and occasionally extended credit to drovers who came through on the trail and were short of funds, a practice that most people in town thought was financially reckless, and that had, in fact, resulted in several significant losses and one very touching repayment 3 seasons later, when a Texas rancher rode back into town, specifically to settle a $4 debt plus interest, and left them a ham besides. Elsie had come to Caldwell from Missouri, where she had spent most of her life on a farm with 3 brothers, and a father who had taught her to shoot and to ride and to keep accounts in a ledger, and had never once suggested that any of these things were inappropriate for a woman to know. Her mother had died when Elsie was 12, and she had run the household from that age forward, which had given her a certain capability and a corresponding impatience with people who dawdled or made excuses. She had come west because Clara had written her a letter describing the opportunities, and because Missouri had begun to feel like a place she had already fully understood, and she wanted to encounter something she did not yet understand. She had not, in 2 years in Caldwell, found a man who interested her in any significant way. This was not for lack of options. Men were abundant in a cattle town, and a number of them had made their interest known to her with varying degrees of skill and self-awareness, and she had been polite to all of them and genuinely warm with a few, and had simply not felt that particular pull she had read about in her mother's books and heard about in the songs that old Clement played when he was in a sentimental mood. She was not the type to manufacture feelings she didn't have, and she was not the type to settle, and so she had continued to run her store and ride out to the prairie on Sunday mornings on her horse, a steady bay mare named Button, and read her books in the evenings and tell herself that she was content, which was mostly true except for the hollow places. She noticed Gilbert because he was the only completely still person in the room. Everyone else in the dusty lantern that evening was in motion, drinking, talking, gesturing, turning on the dance floor, laughing too loudly, arguing about trail conditions. Gilbert was sitting against the back wall like a man who had grown there, quiet as a fence post, watching everything with dark eyes that missed nothing, and there was something in that stillness that caught her attention and held it in a way she could not immediately explain. She watched him for a moment longer than was probably polite. He didn't notice, or if he did, he gave no sign. "Who is that?" she asked Clara. Clara looked. "I have no idea," she said. "Trail rider by the look of him. Probably came up from Texas with the Dalton herd. He looks like he's waiting for something," Elsie said. "He looks like he's waiting for the room to be empty," Clara said, which was perceptive. Elsie watched him for another few minutes. She watched him watch the dancers, Watched the way his expression shifted just slightly when the laughing couple near the center nearly collided with another pair. Watched him take careful, measured sips of his whiskey and set the glass down with the particular deliberateness of a man who is mindful of what he allows himself. She watched him and she thought, there is something in that man that is worth knowing. She could not have said why she thought it. It was not a rational conclusion. It was the kind of thing that arrives fully formed from somewhere, below the level of argument. Old Clement launched into a new song, something with a faster tempo, and 3 more couples joined the floor and the noise level rose considerably. Elsie made up her mind. "I'm going to ask him to dance," she told Clara. Clara turned to look at her with an expression that contained both amusement and genuine alarm. "You don't know him," she said. "I know," Elsie said. "He might be a terrible person." "He might," Elsie agreed pleasantly and set down her glass. Clara grabbed her arm. "Elsie." "Clara, you cannot just walk up to a stranger in a saloon and ask him to dance." "Watch me," Elsie said and crossed the room. She was not a reckless person by nature. She had made this decision with the same focused clarity that she brought to every significant decision in her life, which was to say that she had looked at it from several angles very quickly, assessed the worst probable outcomes: embarrassment, rejection, making a fool of herself, found them all survivable, and concluded that the potential upside was worth the risk. She had not survived losing her mother at 12 and building a business from nothing in a frontier cattle town by flinching from things that scared her. She walked up to his table. Gilbert looked up. She would remember the exact color of his eyes for the rest of her life, a deep, dark brown that had amber in it at the edges, steady and watchful and startled all at once. "I haven't seen you here before," she said. "Rode in today," he said. His voice was low and careful, the way voices get when a person has learned to choose their words. "Are you planning to dance?" she asked. Something moved behind his eyes. "No," he said, and the word had the weight of something he had said many times before. Elsie tilted her head. She did not look away. "Would you dance if someone asked you?" The silence that followed was approximately 3 seconds long. It felt longer. Gilbert Maddox looked at this woman with the escaped pieces of auburn hair and the pine needle green dress, looked at her with the directness she was aiming at him, and he felt his mouth say, "Yes," before any other part of him had been consulted on the matter. His boots would have argued, if boots could speak. His better judgment would have cited a long list of reasons. The part of him that had been keeping that hollow feeling at arm's length for the better part of a decade would have said a great deal. But his mouth said yes, and Elsie Kendrick smiled and she extended her hand, and Gilbert Maddox stood up from that corner table for the first time in his life and let someone lead him onto a dance floor. He was not a good dancer. He was willing to state this plainly and did, approximately 4 seconds into the attempt. "I should warn you," he said, "that I have never done this." "Never," she said. She had placed his hand at her waist and taken his other hand and was looking up at him with an expression that was both amused and perfectly serious at the same time, which he found immediately disorienting. "Not once," he said. "Then pay attention to your feet," she said, "and don't lead until you know what you're doing." He paid attention to his feet. She was patient with him in the way that competent people are with beginners, not condescending, just clear, guiding without making a production of it. He stepped on her boot twice in the first minute, and she made a small sound that might have been a wince and then said, "Other foot," in a tone of such calm practicality that he actually laughed. It came out of him unexpected, that laugh, rough and rusty from disuse, and it surprised him more than it surprised her. "You have a good laugh," she said. "I don't use it much," he said. "I can tell," she said. "You should use it more." They danced through the end of that song and into the beginning of the next one, and somewhere in the middle of the second song, he found the rhythm and stopped thinking about his feet, and the world reduced itself to the fiddle music and the amber light and the woman in the green dress who was looking at him with those clear, direct eyes, and something in his chest did something that he had absolutely no framework for understanding. When the music stopped for a pause, she said, "I'm Elsie Kendrick. I run the dry goods store on Main Street." Gilbert Maddox, he said. I run cattle. He paused. Currently for Mr. Dalton's outfit, but the drive's finished. I'm not currently running anything. She studied him for a moment. Where are you headed next? I haven't decided, he said, which was true. She nodded slowly as if this information was interesting rather than concerning. Would you like to sit down and have a drink that isn't consumed entirely alone? He looked at her. He looked at the corner table he had vacated. He looked back at her. Yes, he said, for the second time that evening, and his better judgment was equally unconsulted in the matter. They sat at a small table near the edge of the dance floor, and Elsie flagged down the table boy and ordered 2 glasses of lemonade, which surprised Gilbert, who had expected more whiskey. The lemonade was not excellent, but it was cold, and she explained that she had a policy against drinking more than 1 whiskey in the Dusty Lantern because she had seen what whiskey did to judgment in cattle towns, and she had a store to open at 7 in the morning. He told her he respected that. She said she didn't require his respect for it. She just did it. He found this entirely reasonable and said so. They talked for 2 hours. Not the careful circling talk of strangers who are trying to impress each other, but something more direct and quicker than that, as if they had both been conserving words for years and could afford to spend them now. He told her about the drives, about Texas, about his father's ranch and the drought that had taken it, about the particular quality of the light in the Indian Territory at dawn, which was unlike any light he had seen anywhere else. She told him about Missouri, about her father and brothers, about coming west with Clara, about the store and the credit they extended, and the ham the Texas rancher had brought back, and he laughed again at that story, and she looked pleased when he did. He did not tell her about the hollow feeling. He did not have words for it yet, but he noticed, somewhere around the 2nd hour, that it was quieter than usual. Clara came to the table eventually, and introduced herself with the expression of someone who had been watching developments with great interest from across the room. She was warm and practical, and took Gilbert's measure with a speed that would have been unsettling if she had been less friendly about it. She asked him 3 questions that seemed casual and were not, and he answered them honestly because he could not think of a reason not to, and she nodded as if the answers had confirmed something, and then excused herself on the basis of needing to speak to someone at the bar. She was testing me, Gilbert said. Of course she was, Elsie said. She's my business partner and my closest friend. She takes the job seriously. Did I pass? He asked. Elsie considered this with apparent seriousness. Ask me in a week, she said, which meant he understood that she was planning to still know him in a week. Something settled in his chest at that, warm and slightly alarming. They stayed until old Clement packed away his fiddle and the Dusty Lantern began its slow process of emptying out. Gilbert walked her home. This was not planned, it simply happened. She was heading for the door and he fell into step beside her without anyone deciding anything. The night air was sharp and cold, carrying the smell of dried grass and distant cattle and the particular clean darkness of a Kansas autumn, and the street was quiet now except for the distant sound of someone's horse and a dog barking 2 streets over. Her house was 4 blocks from the saloon, a small, solid wooden building with a front porch that had 2 chairs on it and a pot of dried flowers she hadn't gotten around to throwing away. He stopped at the porch steps. "Thank you for the dance," he said. He meant to say it simply, but something in his voice made it come out heavier than that, as if he understood already that the dance had been significant in a way he could not entirely articulate. She looked at him in the dark, and the moonlight made her face very clear. "You're welcome, Gilbert Maddox," she said. "Don't leave Caldwell before you've had a proper breakfast somewhere." "I won't," he said. He meant it as a polite response. He did not know yet that he meant it entirely literally. He went back to the livery stable where he had left Copper, checked on the horse, spread his bedroll in the empty stall the liveryman had offered him, and lay there in the dark with his hands behind his head, listening to Copper breathe and the distant sounds of the town settling into night. He had meant to leave in the morning. He had no reason to stay. There was no drive, no job, no particular direction. He was a man who moved because moving was what he did, and staying had never felt like an option that applied to him. He lay in the dark and thought about clear eyes and a pine needle green dress and the sound of his own laugh surprising himself. He did not leave in the morning. He was awake before dawn, as was his habit, and he sought a copper, and then walked to the small lunch counter 2 blocks from the livery, a place called Me's that was apparently the source of the proper breakfast Elsie had recommended. And it was indeed proper eggs and salt pork and bread that had been baked that morning and coffee so strong it had its own opinions. He ate it slowly and listened to the town come alive around him, the sound of hammers from somewhere north of town where someone was building, the clatter of a freight wagon on the main street, a rooster who had clearly decided that dawn was more of a general suggestion than a specific time. He went to the dry goods store at 9 o'clock. He told himself he needed to resupply before the next drive. This was true. He did need to resupply. He needed hardtack and coffee and salt and possibly a new pair of work gloves. These were genuine requirements. Elsie was behind the counter when he walked in, making notes in a ledger with a pencil held in her left hand. She looked up and he saw the quick flash of something pleased in her expression before it settled into the more neutral look of a shopkeeper. "Gilbert Maddox," she said. "I need provisions," he said. "Most people do," she said. He bought his hardtack and coffee and salt. He bought the work gloves. He spent considerably longer in the store than was strictly necessary for this purpose, finding reasons to look at various items on the shelves, while Elsie moved around the store doing the things a shopkeeper does, and they talked in the easy, interrupted way of people who have other things to do but keep returning to the conversation. He came back the next morning for a tin of matches he had forgotten. The morning after that, he came back for nothing in particular, and this time she did not pretend there was a commercial reason for the visit, and she came around the counter and said, "Clara is handling the store this afternoon. Would you like to see the town?" He would like to see the town. He would very much like to see the town. They walked the length of Caldwell together in the October afternoon, and she showed him the parts of it that she had learned to love and the parts that still surprised her and the parts she had complicated feelings about. She showed him the church that the congregation had built themselves out of whatever wood they could find, slightly crooked but solid, and the schoolhouse where 30 children came every day to learn from a young teacher named Miss Hargrove who had come down from Ohio and stayed, and the market garden that a family named Ito had established on the eastern edge of town, the only vegetable garden of any significance in the area, which Elsie regarded with profound admiration. She told him about the Cheyenne and Arapaho bands who had been pushed further and further from this land over the last decade. She did not talk about it abstractly or in the past tense. She talked about it with the quiet anger of someone who had seen it happening and had not known what to do with that knowledge. She had befriended a woman named Morning Star, the wife of a trader who came to Caldwell twice a year, and Morning Star had told her things about what was being lost that Elsie carried with her everywhere. "It bothers me," she said plainly, "that we built this town on something that was taken." He was quiet for a moment. He had seen the taking from various distances and angles over his years on the trail. He did not have a resolution to offer her. He said, "It bothers me too," which was not nothing. She looked at him as if this answer meant more than its words. "Most men in cattle towns don't say that," she said. "I know," he said. They walked back through the town in the long golden light of the October afternoon, and their shoulders were almost touching, and the distance between them was charged with something that both of them were very aware of, and neither of them was ready to name yet. That evening, he had dinner at Me's, and Elsie happened to come in, and he stood and asked if she would like to join him, and she sat down and they ate dinner together as if it was a thing they had been doing for years. The food was good. The conversation was better. He told her stories from the drives that made her laugh, and she told him stories from the store that made him laugh, and at some point he realized that laughing had stopped feeling unfamiliar. He had been in Caldwell 4 days. He had not made any plans to leave. This was unprecedented in his life since the age of 22, and he regarded it with a certain wary uncertainty, the way a man who has only ever slept under open sky regards the idea of a roof, appreciating its value theoretically while not being entirely sure what to do with it in practice. At the end of the first week, he found work. It was not planned. He had been walking past the livery stable when Jake Farnsworth, who owned it, had come out swearing at the state of the roof, which had developed a serious structural problem after a heavy wind 2 nights before. Gilbert had the kind of practical knowledge that comes from a life of fixing things in remote places and had looked at the roof situation and told Jake what needed doing, and Jake had looked at him and said he'd pay him 50 cents a day to do it. So he fixed the livery stable roof. It took a week and a half because the damage was more extensive than it had appeared from the outside, and while he was at it, he noticed that one of the stable's weight-bearing posts had begun to rot at the base, and he replaced that too, and Jake looked at the finished work and said he could stay in the corner stall for as long as he wanted, free of charge. He had a place to sleep. He had a small income. He had a reason to be in Caldwell that had a foundation under it now, even if the foundation had been built after the fact. He was building reasons. He understood this about himself. He was building them carefully, one at a time, like a man who is not quite ready to admit what he is actually doing. He saw Elsie every day. This happened naturally and incrementally and entirely deliberately. He came to the store in the morning, sometimes for supplies and sometimes not. They ate at Me's sometimes, and sometimes she brought food to the porch of her house where they sat in the evening with the cold autumn air coming down from the north, and watched the sky go dark and talked about everything and nothing in alternating measures. He met her father's letters through her descriptions of them. He wrote to her every week from Missouri, her father, and she read the best parts aloud sometimes with an expression of such unguarded affection that it did something to Gilbert's chest that was becoming familiar. He met her friend's circle, which consisted primarily of Clara and me, who ran the lunch counter and was approximately 60 years old and had opinions about everything and kept them. Me looked at Gilbert the second time he came in and said, "You're the one who danced with Elsie Kendrick." He said he was. Me said, "About time someone did," and poured him coffee without being asked. In the 3rd week of October, something happened that shifted things. There was a man named Vern Cutler who had been coming into the dry goods store with increasing frequency, buying small things and taking longer than necessary, and talking to Elsie in a way that Elsie found irritating. Vern was a foreman on one of the cattle operations north of town, broad-shouldered and not unpleasant-looking, and he had decided that his interest in Elsie Kendrick was something that persistent presence would eventually convert into mutual feeling. He had not read the signals she was sending him, which were clear, because he was the kind of man who had decided what was going to happen and had not built into his plan the possibility that the woman had her own views. On a Tuesday morning when Gilbert came to the store, he found Elsie behind the counter with a tight, controlled expression and Vern Cutler leaning on the counter from the other side saying something in a low voice. Gilbert had very good instincts about rooms. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Elsie looked up and saw him, and the tight expression shifted, not to relief exactly, but to something that had steadier footing in it. "Gilbert," she said, "I'm glad you're here. I need someone to move those crates I mentioned." He had mentioned no crates. She had mentioned no crates. He was across the room in 3 steps, and beside her before Vern. Cutler had fully processed what was happening, and he said "morning" to Cutler in the level tone that men on the trail use when they are being civil at some personal cost, and Cutler straightened up and looked at Gilbert and at Elsie, and did a series of calculations with whatever machinery he used for such purposes. "I'll come back later," Cutler said. "I'll be busy later," Elsie said pleasantly. Cutler left. The bell above the door rattled behind him. Gilbert looked at Elsie. She had her arms crossed and was looking at the door with the expression of a woman who has been dealing with something tiresome for longer than was warranted. "Are there actually crates?" he asked. "There are always crates," she said, "but that's not why I said it." "I know," he said. She looked at him. Something was different in the air between them than it had been before. It had been building, that something, accumulating with the density of weeks, and now it was pressing against them both. "Thank you," she said. "He'll come back," Gilbert said. "I know," she said. "I can handle him." "I know you can," he said. "I'm just saying." "Are you saying you'd like to be available to handle the theoretical crates when he does?" He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said, for what felt like the 100th time, but with an entirely different weight behind it. "That's what I'm saying." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she uncrossed her arms and went to the back of the store and said, "Come look at these actual crates then, because they are genuinely in the wrong place and I've been meaning to move them for a week." He moved the crates. They were heavy and numerous, and the job took an hour. It was one of the more satisfying hours he had spent in Caldwell, which was saying something, because the weeks had been good. When it was done, they were both dusty, and she brought him a cup of water from the pump out back and handed it to him, and their fingers touched on the cup and neither of them moved for a moment. "Gilbert," she said. "Elsie," he said. "What are you doing in Caldwell?" she asked, and this time she did not mean it as a simple question about his activities. He thought about this for a long time, long enough that she must have known the answer was not going to be simple. "I don't entirely know yet," he said finally, which was the most honest thing he could have said, and she seemed to understand that, and she did not look disappointed by it. "When you figure it out," she said, "you can tell me." "I will," he said. November came in cold and sharp. The last of the season's cattle drives came through, and the town filled up briefly and then emptied again as the drovers went south for the winter. Gilbert stayed. He had more work by now. Jake had introduced him to a building contractor named Porter who was putting up 3 new structures on the north end of town and needed a reliable hand, and Gilbert had been working for Porter for 2 weeks. He was not a professional carpenter, but he was competent and careful and could follow a plan, and Porter valued those things. He was in Caldwell. He was working. He was sleeping in the livery corner stall, which was warmer than open prairie but still cold by mid-November, and one evening after dinner at Mies said, with her characteristic lack of preamble, "There's a room above the counter that I don't use. $1.50 a week. You can have it." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because you need a proper room and because I like having someone reliable in the building," she said. "Also because Elsie Kendrick has looked considerably happier since you started coming in here, and I've known that girl for 2 years, and she deserves to be considerably happier." He moved into Mies' upstairs room the following morning. It had a window that looked out over the main street and a narrow bed and a washstand and a hook for his coat. It was the smallest room he had ever lived in, and he found it, inexplicably, deeply comforting, in the way that very small things with solid walls can be comforting after years of infinite open sky. He sat on the narrow bed that first night and looked at the wall and thought about what Mies had said. Elsie had looked considerably happier. He thought about this carefully, with the focused attention he gave to things that mattered. He thought about the way she laughed. He thought about the way she talked about her father's letters and Morning Star and the injustice of the land and the ham the Texas rancher had brought back. He thought about her hand in his on the dance floor, warm and certain. He thought about her clear eyes in the dark outside her porch, saying, "Don't leave before you've had a proper breakfast." He understood, sitting on that narrow bed in Mies' upstairs room, what he was doing in Caldwell. He was staying. He had not been a man who stayed, and now he was becoming one, and the change was as quiet and fundamental as the shift in a river's course, gradual from the outside, absolute from the inside. He went to the dry goods store the next morning and waited until there was a lull in the customers, and then he said to Elsie directly, in the way he had come to understand she preferred to be spoken to, "I've been in Caldwell 5 weeks." "I know," she said. "I'm going to be here through the winter," he said. She had her pencil in her hand and she set it down on the counter. "Are you?" she said. It was not quite a question. "I've got steady work with Porter," he said, "and a room at Me's." "I heard," she said, and there was a warmth in it. "I wanted you to know," he said, that I'm not just passing through. I don't want you to think I'm just passing through." She was quiet for a moment. The store smelled of spices and wood and leather, and outside the cold November wind was working on the sign above the door. She looked at him with those clear, steady eyes and she said, "Gilbert, I stopped thinking you were just passing through about 3 weeks ago." Something enormous and very quiet settled in his chest. "Good," he said. "Good," she agreed. He asked her that Sunday if she would like to ride out with him to the prairie west of town. She said she would. She rode Button and he rode Copper, and they went out past the edge of the buildings and into the enormous open land that surrounded Caldwell like an ocean surrounding a small island. And it was cold and clear, and the grass was the color of old straw, and the sky was the particular blue that Kansas does in November, deep and saturated and impossibly wide. He had not realized how much he had missed open space until he was back in it. And he had not realized until this moment that open space was better when shared with the right person. They rode without talking for a while, which was something he had never been able to do with another person, be comfortably silent, and he noted this with the quiet attention he gave to significant things. Eventually Elsie stopped Button at the top of a low rise and looked out over the prairie and said, "This is what I came for. This is why I stayed when staying was hard." He stopped Copper beside her. "What made staying hard?" She was quiet for a moment. "The first winter was very hard. We almost didn't make it through financially. Clara wanted to go back east. I didn't want to go back east. We argued about it." She paused. "I told her we could make it and I wasn't entirely sure I was right, but I believed it, and believing it hard enough turned out to be enough." "She stayed," he said. "She stayed, and we made it." She looked out at the prairie. "I've never once regretted it." He looked at her profile against that November sky and thought, "She is the most genuinely courageous person I have ever met. Not the dramatic kind of courage, not guns and danger. The other kind, the everyday kind that requires you to believe in something through the winter and hold on." He said, "I've been moving for 9 years, following drives, following work, following whatever was next. I told myself it was because the trail was home. But I think—" He stopped. She looked at him. "I think I was just waiting," he said. "I think I didn't know what I was waiting for, so I kept moving to look busy." The wind came across the prairie and moved the grass and found the open places in his coat, and she looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before, soft and certain at the same time, and she said, "You can stop moving now if you want." He looked at her for a long time. The sky was very blue. "I know," he said. And then, because he had decided that the moment called for something more direct than implications, "Elsie, Gilbert, I would very much like to court you properly," he said, "if you'd allow it. I would like to speak to you and spend time with you, and I would like the right to consider you mine and for you to consider me yours, if that's something you want." She looked at him for one full measured moment. "Gilbert Maddox," she said, "I asked a stranger to dance in a saloon 6 weeks ago because I looked at him and thought, there is something worth knowing in that man. I have been right every single day since then." She paused. "Yes, I would allow it." He smiled. Not the almost smile from the first night, the real thing, and it broke across his face with the somewhat awkward quality of a muscle being used after long disuse. She looked at it, and her own face did something that made his heart feel like it had stepped into sunlight. They rode back to Caldwell in the late afternoon, their horses walking easy beside each other, their shoulders occasionally close enough to brush, and the town grew back up around them as they came down from the rise, and it looked different to Gilbert than it had when he'd ridden in, smaller and more specific and entirely more like a place he belonged. The winter was the best season of Gilbert Maddox's adult life, and that was a sentence that would have been incomprehensible to him in October. He worked for Porter 6 days a week on the North End construction, which was cold work in December and January, but honest and satisfying in the way that building things from raw material tends to be. He ate breakfast at Me's and dinner at Me's, and spent the evenings in a variety of places, sometimes at Elsie's small house with the porch, where they sat by her stove and read or talked, sometimes at the store when she was doing accounts in the evenings after closing, sometimes just walking through the quiet streets of the winter downtown with their breath clouding in the cold air. He met her full world that winter. He met the Ito family, whose winter market garden produced remarkable things given the season, and found that Mr. Ito had a knowledge of soil and water that was genuinely impressive, and an opinion about the best way to season cast iron that was entirely correct. He met Miss Hargrove from the schoolhouse, who was intense and principled and deeply committed to the education of every child in Caldwell, and who initially regarded Gilbert with the careful assessment of someone who has seen Elsie be disappointed before, and does not intend to stand by passively through it again. Miss Hargrove warmed to him over the course of December, which he understood was the highest available endorsement. He met Morning Star when she came to Caldwell in January with her husband, the trader Samuel Ames. She was a quiet woman with a direct gaze and a precise way of speaking that reminded him of Elsie, and she and Elsie greeted each other with a warmth that was clearly the warmth of genuine friendship rather than polite acquaintance. He was careful with Morning Star in the way that he was careful with everything he valued, by which he meant attentive and honest, and not attempting to reduce her to any single thing. She watched him for 2 days and then told Elsie in her presence that he had honest eyes, which Elsie told him later was Morning Star's highest available endorsement, and there seemed to be a pattern. Clara, who had been assessing him since the first night, delivered her verdict in February, in the direct manner of a woman who had been waiting to find the right moment. She came to Me's on a Saturday morning when Gilbert was having coffee and sat down across from him and said, without preamble, "You are good for her." He looked at Clara. "I hope so," he said. "I know Elsie," Clara said. "I have known her for most of my life. She is the most capable person I have ever met and the loneliest person I have ever met, and she would never admit to the second thing in those terms. She has been less lonely since October." He held his coffee cup with both hands. "She has made me less," he searched for the word. "Less absent," he said finally. "I was absent from my own life for a long time. She made me present." Clara studied him for a moment. Then she nodded once decisively, with the air of a verdict being issued. "Good," she said, and got up and left. He passed every test. He knew he did, because he could feel the world around Elsie closing in around him like it was including him in something. The gradual warmth of a community deciding that a person belonged. On a night in late February, he and Elsie were sitting on her porch in the cold, wrapped in blankets because the cold had been worse than usual and neither of them had wanted to be inside. And the stars over Kansas were extraordinary, the way they get when there is no cloud and the air is very clear and cold, and the town is dark enough that the sky can do what it wants. He was telling her about the ranch in Texas, about his father, about the specific quality of the grief that came with watching something you loved be taken apart piece by piece rather than all at once. He did not usually talk about his father. He was talking about him now. She listened with her whole self, the way she did everything. When he finished, she said, "What was his name?" "Thomas," he said. "Thomas Maddox," she said, as if giving the name its proper weight. "What would he think of you now?" He considered this genuinely. "He'd want to know if I was saving money," he said. She laughed and he felt it in his chest. "He'd also be glad," he said more quietly. "He was the kind of man who worried about me being too much alone. He'd be glad about," he paused. "He'd be glad about you." The silence between them was the good kind, full rather than empty. She shifted closer on the porch bench and he put his arm around her, which was new, and she rested against him with a naturalness that made the new feel like always. He looked at the stars and thought, "I am home." It was the simplest thought he had ever had. It arrived without argument and without qualification, and it sat in him like something that had always been there, and had only just been uncovered. Spring came to Caldwell in the cautious manner of Kansas springs, which promise warmth and then revoke it several times before actually delivering. March was back and forth, and April was glorious, and then cold again for 2 weeks, and then glorious again for good. The cattle trail started showing life, the first drovers coming up from Texas in their great dusty columns, and the town filled back up with the sound and smell of cattle and horses, and money being spent in the compressed and urgent way of men who have been on the trail and are about to go back on it. Gilbert watched the drives come through with a feeling he didn't entirely know what to do with. He had been a drover for 8 years. The drives were in his blood in a specific and physical way, the rhythm of them, the particular sounds and smells, the strange meditative quality of moving cattle across enormous distances with nothing but horses and men and time. He felt it in his chest when he watched them pass, a pull that was real and complicated. He was also aware that he had built something in Caldwell that the trail would take him away from. And that Elsie Kendrick, who ran a dry goods store and rode her bay mare on Sunday mornings and had 3 brothers in Missouri and a community of people who loved her, was not a woman who could be asked to wait on a man who followed cattle for a living. He chewed on this through April with the focused discomfort of a man who has found the thing he needs to decide and is not yet ready to decide it but can't quite leave it alone. Porter helped settle it, in the accidental way that things sometimes get settled. Porter had reached the end of the 3 buildings and was moving on to a larger commission, a proper hotel, 2 stories, at the northern end of Main Street, and he came to Gilbert in the first week of May and offered him a foreman's position on the project. Not a laborer's wage, a foreman's wage. Oversight of the crew, responsibility for the timeline, a job that would take 18 months and had a real future beyond it if it went well. Gilbert stood in Porter's dusty office and looked at the plans for the hotel spread across the desk and thought about open sky and cattle and his father's ranch and 9 years of moving. He said yes. He meant it completely. He told Elsie that evening on the porch of her house, with the May evening warm enough that they didn't need blankets for the first time since October. She listened, and when he was done she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Porter is a good man and a good contractor. You'll do well with him." "I hope so," he said. I've decided to stay." She looked at him sideways. "You stayed months ago," she said gently. "I know," he said, "but now I've decided it. There's a difference." She reached over and took his hand, and he turned his palm up and laced his fingers through hers, and they sat like that in the May evening and watched the town do the slow, warm things a town does when spring has finally and convincingly arrived. He held the feeling of her hand in his and the decision in his chest and thought, yes. In June, he rode out to Me's brother's property south of town to help with a fence repair, a thing he had agreed to as a favor to me, and he passed a stretch of flat grassland just east of the creek that had a stand of cottonwoods along one side and a view west toward the breaks that caught the afternoon light in a particular way, and he stopped Copper and sat for a long time looking at it. He came back to that land twice more before July. The 3rd time he came back, he went to see Jake at the livery after, because Jake knew everyone who owned everything within 15 miles of Caldwell, and he asked who owned the parcel with the cottonwoods east of the creek on the south road. Jake said it was Mrs. Palmer's parcel, Harriet Palmer, widow of James Palmer, who had been a surveyor and had taken up land claims on a number of things before he died 2 years prior. She had been trying to sell the South Road piece for a year and a half. Gilbert went to see Mrs. Palmer. He was not impulsive. He had not been impulsive since his 20s, and even then only occasionally. But he had looked at that land 3 times, and something in it had said, "Here." In the way that land sometimes speaks to men who have been looking for somewhere long enough. Mrs. Palmer was a practical woman of about 60 who had found the land to be more than she needed and was glad to discuss selling it. She wanted a fair price, which she named, and it was fair, and Gilbert did arithmetic in his head that involved his savings from 8 years of droving and his foreman's wages, and a calculation about how long he could afford to wait. He did not say anything yet. He went back to his room at Mies and he did proper arithmetic with paper, the way his father had taught him. He had been saving money carefully for years because there was nothing particular to spend it on, and the trail provided his necessities. The figure was not as far off as he might have feared. He had a conversation with himself that he later thought of as the most important conversation of his life, even though he was the only participant. He sat at the window of his room and looked at the main street of Caldwell and asked himself, plainly and without evasion, "What are you doing?" And he answered himself, "I am going to buy that land. I am going to build something on it. I am going to ask Elsie Kendrick to marry me, and I am going to hope with everything I have that she says yes." He had never asked a woman to dance. He had never courted a woman with intention. He had never bought land. He had never built anything from the ground up for himself. He had 31 years of not doing these things, and he was about to do all of them in the space of a year, and the thing he felt about it was not fear. It was the thing next to fear that turns out to be readiness. He went to see Porter first. He explained the situation, not all of it but enough, and asked if his work for Porter could be structured to allow him time to work his own parcel. Porter, who was a practical man who appreciated honesty, said yes, on the condition that the hotel job stayed on schedule, and Gilbert said that it would. He went to see Mrs. Palmer and bought the land. He signed the papers at the county record's office in August, and when he walked out, he stood in the street with the deed in his hands and the August sun hitting the top of his head and felt something enormous and quiet and real. He did not tell Elsie about the land yet. He wanted to build something on it first. He wanted to have something to show her. He started building in September on the weekends and on the evenings when there was still enough light. He started with a foundation and a floor plan that was modest and solid, the kind of house a man builds when he knows he is going to live in it for the rest of his life and wants it to stand that long. He had help from 2 men on Porter's crew who came out on Saturdays as a favor, Amos and Charlie, who were good builders and asked no questions about who the house was for. He was aware that he was not being entirely honest with Elsie about where he was spending his weekends, and this bothered him because honesty between them had been the foundation of everything. But he had decided that the surprise was worth the temporary dishonesty, and he held to that decision while also being mildly troubled by it. She noticed he was occupied. She did not press. This was characteristic of her. She gave people space to be what they were going to be, trusted that things would be said when they needed saying. But he could see, occasionally, a quiet question in her eyes that she was choosing not to ask, and that hurt him in a small, precise way, and it made him work faster. The house was not finished in September. It was not going to be finished quickly because he was one man with part-time help and a full-time job, and the honest truth was that it would take most of the winter. And so in October, the anniversary, though he did not call it that, of the night in the dusty lantern, he told her. They were at her house, sitting by the stove, and he had been quiet all evening in the way that she recognized as meaning something was being worked up to. She did not rush him. She poured more coffee and waited. He said, "I bought land." She was very still. He said, "South of town, by the creek with the cottonwood stand. I've been building on it." He paused. "I should have told you sooner. I wanted to show you something first." She set down her cup very carefully. He could not read her expression, and he found this disorienting because he had become very good at reading her. "You're building a house," she said. "Yes." "On land you own." "Yes." The quiet stretched out. He sat with it because there was nothing else to do. "Gilbert," she said slowly. "Elsie," he said. "Are you building that house for yourself," she said, "or are you building it for us?" He met her eyes and said, clearly and without hesitation, "I'm building it for us. I should have said that before I started. I was trying to have something to show you before I said anything, and I know it was cowardly, actually, in its way, because I was afraid you'd say no, and I didn't want to have the conversation with nothing behind me. But the truth is I started building it the moment I knew I was going to ask you, and I've known I was going to ask you since February." She was still very still, and he pressed forward because he had started and there was nothing to do now but finish. "I want to marry you," he said. "I have wanted to marry you for most of this year, and I have been working up to saying it because I don't have the experience of saying it, and I was afraid of getting it wrong. But here is what I know. I know that you are the most courageous and the most honest and the most alive person I have ever known. I know that you made me stop being absent from my own life. I know that I want to spend the rest of my life sitting on porches with you and arguing about the right way to do things and watching you be right about most of them." He swallowed. "I know that I love you. I have known it for a long time, and I have been saying it in every other way except the direct one, and the direct one is, I love you, Elsie Kendrick. Will you marry me?" The stove ticked. The town outside was quiet. He waited. Elsie looked at him for a long time, and her clear eyes were full of something brilliant and warm, and then she said, very quietly and very certainly, "Yes, Gilbert Maddox, I will marry you." He let out a breath that felt like it had been held since October of the previous year. She stood up and he stood up, and they were very close, and she reached up and put her hands on both sides of his face, and he thought he might not have the words for what he felt, but that was all right because words were not what was called for. He kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss or an uncertain one. It was the kiss of two people who have been patient long enough and are certain about each other. She kissed him back with the same directness and warmth she brought to everything. And outside, the Kansas evening was quiet, and the stove was warm, and the world had arrived at something that felt, irreversibly and permanently, like the right place. Clara Whitmore's reaction to the news delivered the following morning was to put her hands on her hips and say, "Took you long enough," to Gilbert directly, and then hug Elsie for a considerable amount of time. Me's reaction was to say nothing at all and go into the kitchen and come back with a piece of apple pie that she set in front of Gilbert with a sort of ceremonial gravity, as if the pie was official, and he ate it and it was excellent. Elsie wrote to her father in Missouri. She wrote him a long letter, longer than her usual ones, explaining who Gilbert Maddox was and how she had come to know him and what she thought of him. And she included in the letter a section that she read aloud to Gilbert before she sealed it, which described him as the most genuinely decent and most thoroughly himself man I have ever met, and the only person who has ever made me understand what my mother's books were talking about. He sat across from her when she read that part and felt entirely insufficient to the description and entirely determined to spend his life earning it. Her father wrote back in 3 weeks. It was a long letter in a man's deliberate, careful hand, and it said, "Any man who would build a house before asking a woman to marry him is a man who thinks about what he is doing. I look forward to meeting him." The wedding was held in the Crooked Church in the last week of November 1879, a full year and 1 month after the night in the Dusty Lantern. The congregation of Caldwell turned out in numbers that suggested the entire town had a personal investment in the outcome, which was not inaccurate. Miss Hargrove was there, and Porter and his wife, and Jake from the livery, and old Clement, who played the fiddle outside the church before the ceremony started, and the Ito family, and Morning Star and Samuel Ames, who had come into town just the week before, and me, who wore her best dress and cried with the straightforward, emotional honesty of a woman who does not believe in pretending she is not moved. Clara stood beside Elsie. Amos from Porter's crew stood beside Gilbert, because when Gilbert had asked him, Amos had looked at him and said quietly, "I'd be honored." And Gilbert had understood that 2 years of working beside a man builds something, even when neither of you talks much. Elsie walked down the aisle of the Crooked Church in a dress that Clara had helped her sew from fabric from their own store, a deep blue wool, the color of the Kansas November sky. And Gilbert stood at the front of the church and watched her come toward him and thought, "I have been walking my whole life to get to this moment. Every trail, every drive, every night under open sky, Every year of motion was just the route that brought me here. The minister, Reverend Cole, was a young man from Ohio who took his work seriously and said the words with genuine feeling. Gilbert listened to every word and responded to each one with absolute attention and sincerity. And when the ring came out of his coat pocket, a simple gold band that he had bought from the jewelers in Caldwell 3 weeks prior, and had been carrying since then with the particular nervousness of a man who is afraid of losing something small and irreplaceable, his hand was steady. He put the ring on Elsie's finger and she looked at it and then at him, and her eyes were full of that same brilliant warmth he had seen the night he asked, and the room was very quiet. Reverend Cole said they were married. Old Clement played something celebratory outside. Clara cried. Me cried. Amos, who was not a crying man, developed a very convincing interest in the quality of the church's ceiling for approximately 30 seconds. Gilbert kissed his wife in the crooked church in front of everyone he had come to call his community in the span of 1 year, and it felt like arriving somewhere, completely and without reservation. The party afterward was held at the Dusty Lantern, which was only appropriate. Old Clement played with more enthusiasm than accuracy, which was perfect. The whole town ate and drank, and the drovers who happened to be in town that week for the last of the season joined in with the great social flexibility of men who will celebrate anything if there is food involved. Porter danced with his wife with considerable skill. Miss Hargrove danced with Amos, which surprised everyone including Amos. The Edo children were allowed to stay up late and danced with each other in the corner with great seriousness. Morning Star found Gilbert standing at the edge of the floor old habits and stood beside him for a moment and said, "She has been waiting for someone worth waiting for." He looked at her and said, "So have I." She nodded once, and the simplicity of the exchange contained more than a longer conversation would have. Gilbert danced every dance that night. He was still not a good dancer, but he was better than he had been a year ago, and Elsie was patient with him in the way she had been that first night, guiding without making a production of it, and they laughed when he stepped on her foot and she said, "Other foot," and it was the same as the first time and nothing like the first time simultaneously. They went back to Elsie's house that night. The house on the South Road with the cottonwoods was not finished yet. There was work still to do on it through the winter, and they would move into it when it was ready. For now, Elsie's small house with the porch and the 2 chairs was home, and it was entirely sufficient. He stood on the porch before they went in, the November cold sharp and clean around him, and looked at the main street of Caldwell sleeping. He thought about the man who had ridden into this town 14 months ago with nothing particular drawing him here and no intention of staying, and the man who stood on this porch now with a wife and a deed, and a house in progress, and a community that had somehow, in the span of a year, become his. The distance between those 2 men was not a year. It was something bigger and harder to measure, the distance between being lost and being found, and the map between them had been drawn in amber lamplight by a woman in a pine needle green dress who had crossed a crowded room because she had made up her mind about something the rest of the world hadn't caught up to yet. The winter was good. The house on the South Road took shape through December and January, Gilbert and Amos working on it in the cold with their breath clouding and their hands heavy with work gloves, and Elsie came out on Sundays with food and stood in the unfinished rooms and looked at the way the afternoon light came through the spaces where the windows would be, and made careful, considered suggestions that Gilbert invariably agreed were right. They moved in the first week of February 1880, which was Elsie's idea because the house was done enough and she was done waiting. It was not entirely finished. The upstairs room needed plaster work and the back porch was framed but not yet floored. But the main rooms were solid and the stove worked and the bedroom had a proper window that looked south over the creek and the cottonwoods. And Elsie stood in the bedroom doorway that first evening and said, "This is where we live," with the quiet certainty of a woman who is saying something both simple and complete. "Yes," he said. They put their things in the house and lit the stove and cooked dinner in their own kitchen, which was the first time either of them had done that. And it was not a transcendent meal, but it was eaten at their own table in their own house, with the cottonwoods visible through the kitchen window and the stove adding its warmth to the room. And it was entirely perfect in the way that ordinary things become perfect when they are new and yours. Elsie continued to run the store. This was not in question. The store was hers and Clara's, and it was doing well, and it was work she was genuinely good at and genuinely loved. She rode Button into town 6 mornings a week, and Gilbert rode Copper, and they rode together in the mornings and separately in the evenings when their days ended at different times, and this arrangement suited them exactly. Porter's hotel job continued through the spring. It was going well. Gilbert had found, over the months of being a foreman, that he had a genuine aptitude for the organizational side of building that he had not known about because he had never been in a position to use it. Porter noticed and said so, and in March made a remark about a partnership in the contractor business that was not quite an offer but was oriented in that direction. In April of 1880, Elsie told Gilbert she was going to have a baby. She told him in the kitchen before breakfast, directly and without ceremony, in the way she did everything. He was at the stove and she came in from the garden looking like she had been thinking about how to say it and had decided the simplest way was best. He turned around. He looked at her. She looked back with that expression he had come to know so well, perfectly calm on the surface, with something enormous just beneath it. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her carefully, with the particular care of a man who is afraid of breaking something precious, and she made a sound against his shoulder that was half laugh and half something that came from further down. "Are you well?" he asked. "Very well," she said. Are you glad?" "More than anything," she said. He held her in the kitchen with the stove going and the morning light coming through the window and the cottonwoods outside and thought, this is the thing. This is the thing that all of it was moving toward. Not just the house and not just Caldwell, but all of it, all 9 years of trail and all the hollow spaces and all the watching from corners and all the years of not knowing what he was waiting for. All of it had been bringing him here. "I love you," he said into her hair. "I know," she said. "I love you too. Now please watch the eggs because I can smell them burning." He laughed and went back to the stove, and she sat at the kitchen table and they ate breakfast together in the ordinary miraculous way of 2 people who have built a life, and the eggs were only slightly overdone. He wrote to her father in Missouri that evening, a letter that took him 3 drafts to get right because he wanted it to be worthy of the news. He told Thomas Kendrick that his daughter was going to make him a grandfather, and that she was well and happy and thoroughly in charge of everything, and that Gilbert was doing his best to be a man her father would be glad to have her married to. He sealed the letter and rode into town to post it, and on the way back, in the early evening light of the Kansas spring, he felt something so expansive in his chest that he almost could not contain it. He had been a man with no future particular he could see. He had a future now that stretched forward with the immensity of the prairie sky, full of years and seasons, and the faces of people he loved. The summer of 1880 was warm and busy and full. Elsie's pregnancy was not complicated, which was a mercy, and she continued to run the store until late August when the practical realities required her to step back, and Clara took on additional responsibility with good humor and genuine competence. Gilbert finished the back porch of the house and built a proper railing for it, and they sat on it in the summer evenings watching the creek and the cottonwoods, and she rested against him, and he had his arm around her, and the world was very good. Her father came from Missouri in August. He was a tall man, gray at the temples, with the same kind of direct eyes as his daughter and the same quality of stillness that does not mean absence but means attention. His name was Robert Kendrick, and he arrived on the westbound stage with a trunk and a shotgun and no discernible anxiety about the journey. He and Gilbert shook hands on the porch of the South Road house, and Robert Kendrick looked at him for a long moment with those direct eyes, and then he said, "She's happy." "I know," Gilbert said. She makes me happy too." "Good," said Robert Kendrick, and that was essentially all that needed to be said on the subject. He stayed 3 weeks. He and Gilbert built the woodshed that Gilbert had been planning since spring, which took 4 days and resulted in a structure that was probably overbuilt for its purpose and entirely solid. They talked while they worked, the way men talk when they have their hands occupied, about Texas and Missouri, and the land and the way things were changing across the West. Robert Kendrick had complicated feelings about many things, as a man of his time who had seen both the promise and the cost of Western expansion, and he expressed them with a frankness that Gilbert respected. They did not agree on everything. They agreed on the important things. When Robert left, he embraced his daughter with the long hold of a man who lives too far away and then shook Gilbert's hand again and said, "Take care of her." "I'll spend my life at it," Gilbert said, which was both a promise and a statement of intention. Robert Kendrick nodded and got on the stage and was gone east, and Elsie stood on the porch of their house with her hand in Gilbert's and watched the stage disappear down the south road. "He approves of you," she said. "I know," he said. "I'll try to deserve it." "You already do," she said. Their son was born in the first days of October 1880, a fact that Gilbert found symmetrical in a way that moved him considerably, because it was autumn and it had been an autumn evening when everything began, and here was the newest beginning arriving in the same season. They named him Thomas Robert Maddox, for both grandfathers, which Elsie had suggested and Gilbert had agreed to immediately and without reservation. And when he held the baby for the first time, this small and furious and perfect person, Gilbert Maddox, who had been alone on the trail for 9 years and had thought perhaps he was suited to being alone, felt the hollow spaces finally, irreversibly fill. He sat in the chair beside Elsie's bed with Thomas in his arms and looked at his wife, who was exhausted and radiant, and watching him hold their son with an expression he had no words for, and he thought about the night in the dusty lantern, about the amber light and the fiddle music, and the woman crossing the room toward him with her mind already made up. He had said yes before his boots could argue. He had said yes to the dance and yes to the lemonade and yes to the walk home and yes to the provisions and yes to the courtship and yes to the marriage and yes to the house and yes to the future. And every yes had been more true than the one before it. And here at the end, or the beginning, he supposed, since it felt very much like a beginning, was the most complete yes he had ever encountered. This small boy with his mother's nose and his father's dark coloring, and the particular startled expression of someone who has just arrived in a world they were not warned about. "Hello, Thomas," he said quietly. Thomas Maddox appeared to be thinking about it. Clara came to the house that afternoon and held the baby and told Elsie that she looked terrible and wonderful in the same voice, which was only Clara. Me came the day after and held Thomas for a long time with her eyes closed and something moving in her face, and then handed him back, and said in her most matter-of-fact tone that he was a fine, solid baby and would do very well, which for me was practically poetry. The years settled in around them, with the steady accumulation of a good life being built. The hotel was finished, and Porter made the partnership offer formal, and Gilbert became a partner in the contracting business, which grew as Caldwell grew, and Caldwell grew, because the trail towns in those years were building themselves into real places, brick by brick and board by board, filling in their own foundations with the weight of the people who chose to stay. He built houses for other people and took satisfaction in every one, knowing that somewhere inside each structure a life was being made that the building was holding up. He thought sometimes of his father's ranch, the one the drought had taken, and felt not the grief he had carried for years, but something more like gratitude, for the loss that had set him moving, for the motion that had brought him here. Thomas grew. He was a particular child, curious and determined, and very loud in the manner of small boys who have found that the world responds to noise, and Elsie managed him with the same focused practicality she brought to everything. Gilbert taught him to ride at 3, which Thomas regarded as the greatest thing that had ever happened to him. He taught him to check a fence line at 4, which Thomas regarded as slightly less great but accepted. He taught him to read at the kitchen table in the evenings, Elsie supervising with the precision of a woman who takes education seriously. And Thomas learned to read with the particular stubbornness of a child who has decided that he wants a thing and will have it. Miss Hargrove, who had by this time become Mrs. Harris, because Amos had asked her, and she had said yes with the decisiveness of a woman who had made up her mind long ago, taught Thomas in the Caldwell school with great rigor and genuine affection, and reported to Elsie and Gilbert that he was extremely bright and required consistent management, which they already knew. In the spring of 1883, Elsie told Gilbert she was expecting again, in the same direct manner as before, over breakfast. He had become better over 3 years of marriage at being demonstratively delighted by good news. She had, gently and consistently, made the case that showing what you felt was not weakness but connection, and he had come to believe her. And so this time he came to her at the table and held her face in his hands and kissed her with an expressiveness that made her laugh. Their daughter arrived in November of 1883 and was given the name Clara Rose Maddox, for her aunt and her grandmother. And Clara Whitmore arrived at the house when she heard the news and was entirely undone in a way she would later describe as deeply out of character and fully understandable given the circumstances. With 2 children and a partnership and a house that had grown as needs required, Gilbert had added 2 rooms in 1881 and a proper front porch to replace the original in 1882. Life in Caldwell had the particular texture of a good thing well used. There was work and there was tired and there were arguments, because Elsie and Gilbert were both strong-willed people with opinions, and the arguments were honest and sometimes loud and always resolved, because they had built the resolution into the center of what they were to each other from the beginning. He never stopped watching her cross a room. This was a thing he noticed about himself. That years of daily proximity had not made the sight of her ordinary. She was as vivid to him in 1884 as she had been in that amber-lit saloon in 1878. This woman who had crossed the room toward him like someone who had already made a decision, and he felt every day the particular good fortune of having been in the right corner at the right time. She did not stop watching him either. She would not have described it in those terms because she was not a sentimental woman in the conventional way, but Clara noticed, and me noticed, and Morning Star, when she came to Caldwell, noticed that Elsie Kendrick moved differently in rooms where Gilbert Maddox was, that her face had a particular quality of ease and warmth that was not her default expression and was entirely his. In the autumn of 1884, on an evening in October that was cool and clear, and starred in the way of Kansas October evenings, Gilbert and Elsie sat on the front porch of the South Road house, the big porch he had built in 1882, with cups of coffee and the particular quiet of parents whose children are in bed asleep and have temporarily ceased requiring anything. Thomas was 4 and Clara Rose was not yet a year old, and the house was full of the weight of 2 sleeping children in the particular cozy way that houses get. She said, "Do you know what happened 6 years ago tonight?" He thought. He calculated. He felt the smile come up in his face with the ease of long practice. "I danced," he said. "You did," she said. "You said yes before you'd thought it through." "I had thought it through," he said. "It took about 3 seconds." "That is not thinking it through," she said. "For me," he said, 3 seconds is extremely thorough." She laughed, and he heard the same laugh he had heard the first night, real and complete, the laugh that made people look over to see what was funny, and it did the same thing to him it had always done. "Are you glad?" she asked. Not uncertainly, she knew the answer. She asked it the way you ask a thing you love to hear confirmed, because some things bear repeating. He looked at her in the porch dark, his wife of 5 years, the woman who had looked at a still man in a loud room and thought, something worth knowing. He looked at her and the house at his back and the cottonwood stand dark against the creek and the enormous Kansas sky above with its extraordinary stars. "Elsie," he said, "I was a man who had nowhere to be and didn't know it. I have a home and a partner and 2 children and a life that I built with someone I love more than I have words for. I said yes to a dance and it was the single most correct thing I have ever done." He paused. "Am I glad?" She shook her head slowly in the way that meant she was smiling. "Yes," she said. "That's what I thought." He reached over and took her hand, the way he had been taking her hand for 5 years, and she turned her palm up and laced her fingers through his, the way she had for 5 years, and they sat on the porch in the October evening, and the stars came out one at a time the way they do when the sky is very clear, and the town was quiet, and the cottonwoods moved in the creek breeze, and the house behind them held their sleeping children and their whole entire life. Thomas Maddox, in his bed upstairs, was already the child who would grow up knowing that his father had once been a man who followed cattle across an endless country, and had walked into a saloon in Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1878 with no particular reason to stay, and had stayed. Had stayed because a woman in a pine needle green dress had crossed the room toward him with her mind already made up, and had asked him to dance, and he had said yes. His boots had not gotten a word in edgewise, and everything that followed, the house and the children and the partnership and the years and the front porch and the cottonwoods, and the mornings that came good, and the evenings that came better, all of it had arrived from that single word, yes, spoken before any other part of him knew what it was agreeing to. He had said yes, and she had led him onto the floor, and the fiddle had played, and it had been, all of it, exactly enough. More than enough. It had been everything.